right, everyone, this is the Word for the Valley podcast. I'll be your host. My name is Jordan, and we're going to be listening to sermons taken from Pastor Mike Gogler's in-depth teaching through the book of Matthew. And in our first episode, Pastor Mike will give an introduction to the book of Matthew, giving us some background on who Matthew was and how he became a disciple of Jesus. In the first chapter, it'll start off with a genealogy, and we'll hear Pastor Mike explain why that genealogy was so important to Matthew's audience then, and what we can learn about the genealogy of Jesus today. So let's listen in as Pastor Mike begins.
I have the header to the book here that it says the Gospel according to Matthew. We know those headers, by the way, and the titles that you have in your margins are not inspired. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not so good. But I think this is a good encapsulation of what we're heading into here, the Gospel according to Matthew. The word gospel means good news. Good news. In the day that we're living in, it's nice to have a little bit of good news every now and then. And the gospel is certainly good news. It's interesting here. It's the gospel of Christ, but it's gospel according to Matthew. Oftentimes when we think of gospel, we think of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which is essential to the gospel. Paul tells us that in the book of Corinthians as he outlines it. But it is interesting that the whole life of Jesus is the gospel in many ways. That it is his birth here as he comes to earth. It's his perfect sinless life. It's his miracles. It's his teachings. All of that then leading to the cross and his death, then his burial, obviously his resurrection, then his ascension. All of that's good news. And you can't really pick and choose parts of, well, I like this part and I don't like that part. It becomes incredibly dangerous if you start to try to determine who Jesus is based on your own personal desires or your own personal understanding. Higher criticism and other forms of kind of scholasticism in regards to the Bible have oftentimes done this, where they want to think, well, this is kind of this is an accurate picture of God, or this is an accurate picture of Jesus, and maybe this isn't so much. And then they get their pens out and their highlighters, and they start crossing different verses off, and then they highlight other verses. And then what you end up doing is you make God into your own image. Basically, you make God look out to be something that you understand. And the remarkable revelation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, even as it's given to us here in Matthew, is that he comes in a way that is so unique that it blows all of our minds. This is unlike any other world religion. This is unlike any other writing. This is unlike anything that man have come up with, or put into paper or into a philosophy or something. Like, this is so much beyond anything that we would ever imagine. People who say that the Bible was just written by men, I'm like, I have never met a man that can write something like this. The reality of it, the meaning of it, the depth of it, and then like just the logical, how it logically fits together. It's just remarkable. And I find it's very humbling. Even his birth, the gospel, the whole thing, even this genealogy is good news. Now, it's written here by Matthew, who is one of Jesus' 12 disciples. The name Matthew means gift of God. If we have any Matthews in here, you know that already. You told your mom a lot of times that you are the gift of God to them. But the gift of God, it's interesting that Matthew is not his original name. His original name was Levi. He was a tax collector. Matthew chapter 9. When Jesus and the disciples are passing by, Jesus calls him. It's interesting. Matthew says, when he saw a man, he called for him and said, "Come, follow me." He saw a man. Now, Levi, having that name, that given name, we know that he was a Hebrew by birth. And we can also tell, as he writes this out here, he gives us more references. There are 129 quotes and references to the Old Testament in the Gospel of Matthew, is far more than any of the other Gospels as they are written out to us, right? It's very much written from a Jewish vantage point, no doubt from a Jewish individual. But it's interesting that when he got called to be a follower of Jesus Christ, he wasn't really a practicing Jew at that point in time. He was a tax collector. He had sided with the Romans. He had taken up an occupation that was anti-Jewish. He in some ways had become anti-Semitic. He had become anti-Jewish. He had taken the side of the Romans. He had taken the side of the Gentiles against the Jewish people. And there's apparently something that happened in his life, and we don't get any details about it, but at some point in time, raised as a Jew, probably trained as a Levite to some degree, kind of knowing the scriptures as well as he knows them to be able to reference them as he does. At some point in his life, he said, you know what, I'm out of here. I don't want any part of this. And it very well may be that he recognized the hypocrisy of Judaism. And he recognized its failure amongst the religious leaders of his day. And looked at that and said, you know, I don't have any part of that. And it's remarkable that sometimes, especially when that comes out of a measure of honesty in our lives, there are some people that use that as an excuse. They use, I can't go to church, there are hypocrites there. And that to them is just an excuse, right? But there are others that recognize deep hypocrisy in their own lives and deep failure in the lives of those around them and say, you know what, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to be phony. I don't want to be lukewarm. I'm going to be cold or hot. When I'm either on or off. I'm not going to try to find that middle road where I can be acceptable to everybody else and still live a life of phoniness. There's no way I want to be a part of that. And it seems like Matthew was one of those and just said, you know what? I'm not going to play the Jewish game. I'm not playing religion. And remarkably, when Christ came to him, he never called him to a religion. He called him to himself. Come follow me, he said to Matthew. Matthew left everything and followed Jesus. And from that point on, obviously, he became a follower, he became a disciple, and he became an apostle, and then he became an author of the gospel. And he's going to give this record to us from his vantage point. Now, there are 4 gospels. We know that, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And oftentimes you'll get the question, why are we getting the same information about the life of Jesus 4 different times? Well, for one, right, if you have somebody in your life that repeats information and they kind of know what they're talking about, your boss, your parents, somebody, it's not just somebody who's losing their memory, right? But they want you to do a good job. If you find that you're hearing the same information repeated from the same person multiple times, it may be that you haven't listened yet, right? They don't feel like you're getting it. That's the reason why they're repeating it. If they thought you got it, they wouldn't say that. They'd move on to something else, and they'd help you get something else, help you learn something else. Right? And oftentimes, it's a measure of how significant it is to the speaker, the repetition of it. And I think in some ways, it is a mark, obviously, that the life of Jesus given to us is very important to God, that we would understand it. And maybe, from God's vantage point even, that it would be almost impossible if it was only given to us from one vantage point. That we wouldn't really get it. We wouldn't understand it. There are things that wouldn't be enough if it was only written through one voice, through one pen, through one person, that it has to be written by multiple individuals so that the different facets and qualities of Jesus, as they are expressed, can be understood by us. Well, Matthew writes, presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the Jewish messiahship. He becomes the Christ. You actually see there in verse 1, he mentions Jesus Christ. Down in verse 16, he mentions Christ. Verse 17, he mentions Christ. And in verse 18, he mentions Jesus Christ. 4 times in the first 18 verses. And given all of the other names, that's a pretty high ratio to start this thing off. It is very much the theme of the book of Matthew. Jesus coming as the fulfillment of the Jewish promises. The Jewish Savior, the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish Christ. Christ means Messiah. Messiah in Hebrew, Christ in Greek, it's the same word. He is the fulfillment of all of the Jewish promises. Now Luke, when he writes, he's going to present Jesus as the Son of Man. When Mark, when he writes, he's going to present Jesus as the servant. When John writes, he's going to present Jesus as the Son of God. He's going to refer to Christ's deity over and over again in his writings. And each of them present Jesus from a different angle, from a different facet, from a different thing, right? And the whole picture of it together is the fullness of who Jesus is. But Matthew's going to focus here in on the messiahship of Jesus. Now, one other kind of caveat before we get into this genealogy is it is significant, and probably more so, to the Jews to have a genealogy that can trace his line all the way back. This in some ways is more important to Jewish people, and especially Jews of Jesus' day, than oftentimes that it is to us. Now, we have Ancestry.com. We have people that do sometimes research regarding family trees and family lines. And to us, it's interesting, and we get some information, right? To the Jew, you almost didn't exist if you couldn't trace your line back to Abraham. If you couldn't connect yourself to Abraham and the father of the Jewish people, it's almost like it didn't matter. Like it's almost like you might as well have just been a Gentile, right? And they connected back to Abraham because they were all looking forward to the anticipation of the Messiah coming into their line, hoping that maybe to some degree that they would participate in that. And so genealogies and these names and all are very important into a Jewish mind, maybe in some ways that they aren't for us. And so we're going to try to give that grace as we work down through here. The other thing about this genealogy is this. These are some really whacked out people. This is a goofy way to introduce yourself to the Gentile world. This is a goofy way to introduce yourself to anybody, right? Introductions do leave impressions, right? That's why, certain people get up to speak. They need somebody to you got to introduce me right. You got to lead me out here. If they're not clapping loud enough, or the band isn't coming on until the audience gets into this kind of pitch or these kinds of things. If you don't introduce me right, I'm not stepping on. It's remarkable. The New Testament could have started with Mark, that has almost no genealogy. Could have started with Luke. Now, Luke's genealogy, he saves it till chapter 3. He does a lot about Mary and the birth of Christ and all that kind of, detail leading up. And then he gives the genealogy in chapter 3, which is a different genealogy from Matthew 1, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But he saves it for chapter 3. In John, his genealogy is and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. That's enough for us, and we'll move right on. You think God could have started with any, if he just reversed the order, it wouldn't have mattered, right, that much. He could have put Mark as the first book of the New Testament. In some ways, it would have made logical sense, especially to a Gentile like me. I thought it would be a great idea if he had put John as the first book of the New Testament. Oftentimes when people come to the church or they come to the faith, they'll say, hey, where should I start reading in the Bible? I'm going to read in Genesis. No, hold on. Whoa, pump the brakes a little bit kind of thing, because you're going to get to chapter 10 and it's going to be all over, right? And you're going to get to the genealogy and the table of nations and the whole 9 yards, and you're like, I melt down, right? Go to the book of John. If you've ever only read one book of the Bible, and the first book of the Bible that you would read the book of John, because it's written so that you would believe in the Son of God. That's what he says. So you would understand what it means to come to faith and who your faith is in. Why doesn't God start with John in the New Testament? That would make sense. No, he starts with Matthew, right? Now, obviously, it flows from the Old Testament, right? We're wrapping up. The Old Testament is coming to fulfillment here. But then he starts off with a genealogy. This is not the way I would have started off kind of presenting the Son of God to the world. And if for whatever reason I felt like this was the way to do it, I would have excluded about half of these names. There are a handful of names that aren't even necessary for the genealogy he throws in. There are 4 women in particular that he mentions in the genealogy. You won't even need to, because this is a legal genealogical line that only goes through the male. But he mentions names, and the ones that he mentions are scandalous. Just very interesting. And I think it proves a point in some ways. Something that God really wants us to get. Again, introductions are significant. That God really wants us to understand what he did when he came to earth. Because there are a lot of people that want to say that God cannot or will not understand their lives. That they've done too much bad. They've been to bad places. They were around too bad people. God would never understand, where Hebrews tells us that Jesus, was made like his brother, and that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God. And then in chapter 4, it says that we have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. I think one of the things that the Lord wants us to know in this genealogy is that however bad your life may have been, however bad your family may have been, however bad your experience may have been, however bad you may have been, that when he incarnated, he didn't incarnate into something better than that. He didn't come into a castle and live with a silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't come to a place that didn't understand pain. He didn't come into a place that didn't understand sin. He didn't come into a life or a family that didn't understand what it is to deal with the fallout of a lot of mess. And you guys know, we all know, I think we all have these skeletons in our closet and these places in our family tree where it leaves generational scars. It leaves pain for generations. To have one person perpetuate certain things and be allowed and promoted in these kinds of things. And what it ends up doing generationally, the kind of pain that it brings into this world, in some ways is unimaginable. The greatest sufferings in this world, the greatest sufferings in this world are perpetrated, are, what's another word? Are enacted by family. Family in some ways has the potential for the greatest joy. Family in many ways is the place where we experience the greatest pain. And to think that maybe somehow God doesn't understand that. To think that he doesn't get it. When he came to earth, he lived a different life. And it was much easier for Jesus than it was for me. And I even hear people say that from time to time. He doesn't know what it's like to have sinned. He doesn't know what it's like to do it. He doesn't understand. There's no way he can understand. He not only understands that, he understands it to a greater degree than you do. And this is just an incredible picture. Now, verse 1, the book of the genealogy, of Jesus Christ. Again, the theme of Matthew, presenting Jesus as the Christ. Again, Christ is the Greek for the Hebrew Messiah. So Jesus, you could say Jesus the Messiah if you wanted to transliterate that way for yourself. This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the son of David. Now, this isn't the genealogy yet. These are just titles, right? So he's Jesus the Christ. He's the son of David. Now, he's going to mention David and Abraham here. These are the two main characters of the Old Testament that the Jewish people identified with in an effort to wait on and trust in the Messiah, right? The king, David, the son of David. It's a messianic phrase. And then the son of Abraham, which the Jewish people almost all took their heritage from, right? You claim that your father is Abraham, right? They would go back to Abraham as their Jewish heritage and these kinds of things. And this is where Jesus comes from. So the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now let me make this point. I wasn't anticipating making this point, but it feels like it's significant right now. Anti-Semitism for a Christian makes no sense at all. It makes no sense at all. There is again around the world, as we've seen over and over again in the history of the last 2,000 years, there is a rising anti-Semitism. There is a rising hatred of the Jews happening all over the planet in pockets. And sometimes in the great kind of disparagement to the church, and some of the worst testimonies of the church, Lutheranism in Nazi Germany, for instance. So when the church sides with the government against the Jewish people, and you're like, do you not understand? The Messiah you claim to follow was of Jewish nationality. He was of Jewish heritage. I know that your picture of Jesus that you have in your mind, right, from the great medieval painters, the great Roman painters of the day, make Jesus look like a modern-day Fabio, right? At first glance, you're really not sure, is it a man or is it a woman? He looks so delicate, kind of thing. His features are so beautiful. And he is pasty white most of the time. And hair, long, dark, curly hair, deep set. Sometimes, this gives it away, blue eyes. And you're like, what? I don't know what Jesus you're painting, but it's probably a Jesus that looks more like you than it looks like him. Jesus of his heritage would have been Jewish. His skin would not have been Caucasian. Would have been olive-skinned, olive-toned. His eyes would have been dark. His hair probably dark. Right? Most likely. And so to stand on the side of anti-Semitism or that, it doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not a big proponent of Jewish nationalism kind of carte blanche either. Right? The Jewish people have done a lot of goofy things and at times need to be held accountable for some of the stupidity that they've enjoined themselves in. Right? Just as a people, as a nation. We have no idea where Bennett's going to go. right? Following up Netanyahu. No idea what's going to happen in this government now in Israel, all right? We don't just give carte blanche, kind of whatever they do is okay. As a nation, as a nationality, right? It's still right and wrong. Still should share the gospel with them, right? Again, to hate the Jews is to hate your own Savior if you're a Christian. It doesn't make any sense at all. Here, Jesus came from the line of the Jewish people. Now, Abraham begot Isaac there in verse 2. It's remarkable how close this story doesn't even get started, right? How close, this story almost doesn't get started. The very first one, Abraham begot Isaac. Abraham was 100 years old when he begot Isaac. Not only that, Abraham tried as best he could to mess up all the promises of God leading up to Isaac's birth, right? There were 2 times he actually told foreign kings that his wife, who he would have Isaac with, was his sister. Now, I don't know if that speaks to Sarah's grace or stupidity to stay with a guy who literally wants to hand her off to be a part of a king's harem. And he had done that to her twice. Not only that, he had taken Hagar. Now, that was at Sarah's request. Had Ishmael, right? He had messed up his family before Isaac even came because he struggled in waiting for the promises of God. This is Isaac, right? The great father of the Jewish faith. Failed so many times. Now, he begot Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob. It's interesting here, no mention of Esau, right? He begot Jacob and Esau. They were twins. But we're only going to talk about Jacob here. And it's interesting because Isaac's favorite son was not Jacob. Isaac's favorite son was Esau. Isaac tried to give the blessings. He tried to give the birthright. He tried to give all of these things that really the Lord had ordained Jacob for. He tried as best he could to give them to Esau. Esau had no point in time in them. He didn't care about them much at all, right? And so then they eventually got to Jacob by hook and by crook kind of thing, but they end up getting to Jacob, right? But this is a family, right? They're playing favorites, choosing sides. And in some ways, Isaac, he wanted the fleshly one. He didn't want the spiritual one. Wasn't a particularly spiritual man. Had to be brought to it later in his life. Isaac begot Jacob. Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Now that sounds fun until you realize it's 12 boys through 4 women. And the disaster that becomes in that household. I mean, the women are literally buying Jacob for the night. Right? Depending on who gets to have him in their tent for that evening, right? And so, needless to say, there is some dysfunction within that family. That's the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. That's how God births this nation. There, Jacob. We got Judah, and he mentions Judah by name, and then the other brothers as well. Judah, now in verse 3, begot Perez and Zerah. Look, first mention of a woman in the genealogy by Tamar. Perez and Zerah, twins, that Judah had conceived with Tamar, who just happened to be his daughter-in-law. Well, you got to give him some credit. He didn't sleep with her willingly. He thought she was a prostitute, so that must make it better. That's sarcasm, if you didn't catch that. So this is how Judah conceived Perez and Zerah. You can read that in the book of Genesis. Perez then begot Hezron and Ram, and Hezron then begot Ram, and then Ram begot Amminadab, and Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. There's some names, obviously, that we have in the book of Genesis, but we don't have the time to highlight every single one and everything that they did. So we're going to move to verse 5. Salmon then begot Boaz. Look, by Rahab, the second mention of a woman in the genealogical line, Rahab, who again just happened to be a Canaanite prostitute before she met the spies. Just happened to be, right? She is a woman of incredible faith in the book of Joshua, right? But she is also a woman of quite ill repute. It's remarkable that anybody of the Jewish nation would have even married her. When she gets amalgamated into the Jewish people through faith, then this Salmon goes out of his way and takes her into his own house. It's just a remarkable act of grace and a real picture of the measure of repentance that she would have had. If her character would have reflected anything of Canaan, she probably would have been stoned or sent outside of the, even later, she would have been removed from the nation. What she does and what she changes to become, her conversion, what it does to her for the remainder of her life, allows her to fully amalgamate into the family and then take a husband and then have Boaz as a child. Well, then Boaz beautifully begot Obed by Ruth, the third woman mentioned here. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Ruth is one of the most beautiful books in the entire Bible. If you're going to read the book of Ruth, though, read the first couple or the last couple of chapters of Judges right before you get to Ruth. Because the dark backdrop makes the book of Ruth shine even more brightly. And you realize what kind of condition the nation of Israel was in at the time when Ruth came into the land. But Ruth came into it sincerely. And what God did with her as a result is remarkable. Now, Ruth was a Moabitess. It actually said in the law that the descendants of a Moabite couldn't go to the tabernacle for 10 generations. They had to wait for 10 generations to even be a part of the tabernacle. Remarkably, within three generations, their great-great-grandson, or whatever that is, great-grandson, is designing the plans for the temple. David. Just God's grace, God's working, God's overcoming that's an interracial marriage, by the way. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff happening there. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed then begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David, the king.
All right, well, up to this point, we learned that Matthew was a Jew who was considered a traitor to his own people because he chose to be a tax collector for the Romans. And even though Matthew was rejected by his own people, Jesus chose him to be one of his disciples. We also learned that Matthew was writing to present Jesus to the world as the Messiah and the rightful King of the Jews through the legal line of David. Well, tune in next time as we continue our teaching through the genealogy of Jesus Christ. This is the Word for the Valley podcast. So long, everyone.